People often ask me, do you believe in God? Which I don't like that question. First of all, it's an attempt to box me in a sense. And the reason that it's an attempt to box me in is because the question is asked so that I can be firmly placed on one side of a binary argument. And the reason I don't like to answer it is because A, I don't like to be boxed in, and B, because I don't know what the person means by believe or God. And they think they know. And the probability that they construe belief and construe God the same way I do is virtually zero. So it's a question that doesn't work for me on multiple levels of analysis. But strangely enough, just as we were talking, the answer to that question popped into my head. I act as if God exists. Now, you can decide for yourself whether that means that I believe in him, so to speak. But I act as if he exists. So that's a good enough answer for that. Then with regards to these other issues, the divinity of Christ, well, I would say the same problems with the question formulation obtain. What do you mean by divine? And also, what do you mean by Christ? These are very, very difficult questions. Now, I believe that, for all intents and purposes, I believe that the Logos is divine. Insofar as if by divine you mean of ultimate value, of ultimate transcendent value, yes, it's divine. It's associated with death and rebirth, clearly, because the Logos dismantles you and rebuilds you. So that's what happens when you make an error. When you make an error, some part of you has to go. That's a sacrifice. You have to let it go. Sometimes it's a big part of you. Sometimes it can be such a big part of you that you actually die, right, instead of dying and being reborn. Is there something more than merely metaphorical about the idea of dying and being reborn? Yes, there is, because those are associated with physiological transformations. What's the ultimate extent of that? That's a good question. You know, the question is, what happens to the world around you as you increasingly embody the Logos? And the answer to that is, we don't know. We don't know what the ultimate level of this. Now, the hypothesis is, and it's a hypothesis that extends to some degree to Buddha as well, the hypothesis is that there has been one or two individuals who managed that, and that in their management of that, they transcended death itself. Well, then you might ask yourself, well, what do you mean by transcended death? Well, in the case of Christ, let's assume he was a historical figure for the time being, which I think is the simplest thing to assume. I think there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. You could conclude otherwise, but personally, I feel that there's sufficient evidence to conclude that. Is his resurrection real? Well, his spirit lives on. That's certainly the case.
In what sense do you mean spirit? Just to qualify that.
Well, let's imagine that a spirit is a pattern of being. And we know that patterns can exist, patterns can be transmitted across multiple substrates, right? Vinyl, electronic impulses, air, vibrations in your ear, neurological patterns, dance. It's all the translation of what you might describe as a spirit, right? It's that pattern. It's independent of its material substrate. Well, Christ's spirit lives on. It's had a massive effect across time. Well, is that an answer to the question? Did his body resurrect? I don't know. I don't know. The accounts aren't clear, for one thing. What the accounts mean isn't clear. I don't know what happens to a person if they bring themselves completely into alignment. I've had intimations of what that might mean. We don't understand the world very well. We don't understand how the world could be mastered if it was mastered completely. We don't know how an individual might be able to manage that. We don't know what transformations that might make possible. I'm going to do a series on the Bible. that's one of the things I want to investigate more thoroughly and formulate my thoughts about more thoroughly, because it is a crucial issue. A friend of mine said, and I wouldn't describe him, he's certainly not the sort of person that you would describe as a classic Catholic. He's an extraordinarily well-educated individual, and he's come back to Christianity with the most vicious of internal battles, you know. And he said to me, he was the same person who made the comments earlier about the dominance hierarchy, and so he's very insightful. You know, he said that it all falls apart unless you believe in the divinity of Christ and in the resurrection of Christ. And he meant that in a very fundamental way. And there's a way in which that's true, but I don't know exactly what it means yet. Like, the metaphorical element of that to me is quite clear. The death and rebirth idea, yeah, I mean, you see that echoed all over. It's the most recent manifestation of that idea is, or one of the most recent manifestations, popular manifestations, is in the Harry Potter series, because it's full of deaths and rebirths of the central hero.
Is it not a manifestation of hope for something beyond the finality with which of which we've become inescapably conscious?
Well, yes, and of course that's the Freudian critique, right? He just thought about it as a wish fulfillment. Although the problem with that theory is, well, you know, people also generated up the idea of hell, which doesn't, you know, you could say, well, that's a convenient place to put your enemies and still put it in the wish fulfillment framework, but I think that's absurdly cynical. I mean, people who believe in hell are terrified of hell for themselves, and in my estimation, they should be, because I also believe in hell, although what that means, again, is, you know, subject to interpretation. Lots of people live in hell, and lots of people create it.
But beyond the sort of the basic Freudian, you know, snide interpretation,
yeah.
Is it not a belief in the identification with something that transcends your limited existence?
Yes, definitely. But it's funny too, because in the more Christian formulations, there's an insistence on the resurrection of the body, which I find extremely interesting. You know, even the, say, more sophisticated deist types are kind of willing to go along with the idea that there might be something eternal, transcendent about consciousness, or about the spirit or the soul, something like that. But they're certainly not willing to go beyond that. But there's this very peculiar emphasis in Christianity on the resurrection of the body, which is a glorification of the body, which is quite interesting. You know, it's not something you want to dismiss so rapidly, because it is a glorification of the body and an indication of the necessity of the body, of that limitation.
Could that not be an instance of what we were describing earlier in terms of a specific instantiation of a general principle?
Yeah, right.
And it's the instantiation itself that makes it real. The body is the most real thing that we experience on an individual.
Right. Well, and it's real in part because it's limited. Right? It has limitations.
So the focus on the mythological representation of the body as resurrected is saying this is more real. This is just as real as you can imagine.
Yes, yes. Well, it's an elevation of the material, interestingly enough, right? Not a denial of the material, an elevation of the material. It's a very interesting idea. And as I said, I want to explore that more, because I'm not fully comfortable with my ability to bridge the gap between the metaphorical and the real, although I think that the way that I described it is as close as I can come right now. Magical things happen as the Logos manifests itself. Now, that's self-evidently true. When people...
And when you say magical, you mean magical for all intents and purposes in terms of our perception as relatively naive human consciousness, or magical in, like, you know, rabbits out of hats?
Well, certainly the former. And God only knows about the latter. So, you know, that takes us afield into strange areas. Like Jung's observations of synchronous events, for example. Yes. We don't understand the world. Like, I do think the world is more like a musical masterpiece than it is like anything else. And things are oddly connected. Now, you know, I know that sounds new agey and it sounds metaphysical, and I'm saying bluntly, this is speculative, right? I'm feeling out beyond the limits of my knowledge. But there are things I'm not willing to dismiss the mysterious, because I've experienced the mysterious in a variety of different ways, and it's very mysterious, very.
from a cognitive perspective, is that not the most rational position to take in any case? Because we know our cognition is inherently bounded by a whole range of constraints.
Well, we certainly know that we're bounded by ignorance, and that there's far more going on than we know or can know. We do. The problem is that when you start to speculate, it's a projection of your imagination. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that is actually, knowledge advances through projection of imagination. But the problem is you can see yourself reflected back at you, and then it's self-fulfilling. So you can see what you want